Drawing trend lines can change the way that you trade, but you need to draw them correctly. In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw them the right way. I'm going to give you 3 different guidelines that you can use to check when you're drawing your trend lines. And at the end of the video, we're going to go through some examples of drawing trend lines, and we're actually going to go through a chart pattern and how to draw the chart pattern trend lines properly. Before we look at how to draw trend lines, let's try to understand why we are drawing these trend lines to begin with. Firstly, we draw trend lines so that we can tell the direction of the trend. In this situation, we can tell that this ticker is trending downwards. A downtrend is when we're making lower lows and lower highs. Conversely, an uptrend is when we're making higher highs and higher lows. So let's put a trend line on this screen in the direction of the trend. So now that we have the trend line drawn, it's visibly obvious that we are in some type of channel. So let's go ahead and draw the upper trend line in order to encapsulate all of the price action. So not only have we identified the direction of the trend, we have also identified support and resistance in this channel, because we can see that we have touches at the top of the channel and we have touches at the bottom of the channel. And lastly, another thing that we can identify with trend lines is a possible reversal. Now, we can't use trend lines on their own to spot a possible reversal, but when we combine trend lines with other forms of technical analysis, then we can start looking for possible reversals. Because our trend lines identified a channel and our trend lines identified support and resistance that we continuously tested, we can look for other signs of a possible reversal. And you can see by this chart that we actually did have a reversal in this case. Now that we understand why we're drawing these trend lines, let's look at how to draw trend lines. So when we're drawing trend lines, it's important that we make these trend lines as valid as possible. So I'm going to give you 3 different guidelines to use when you're drawing your trend lines. Your trend line must touch at least 3 candlesticks. And the more candlesticks that you intersect with your trend line, the more valid that your trend line becomes. If you have less than 3 touches, then it's not a valid trend line that you should even be considering. Now, when you're drawing your trend lines, you can use the candlestick or the candle body to draw the trend lines, but make sure you make your choice consistent. So if you've chosen to use candlestick bodies, make sure that your trend line always intersects with the candlestick body wherever possible. Now, when you're drawing your trend line, make sure you touch as many candlesticks or bodies, whatever you've chosen, as possible. So this will dictate the direction and the shape of your trend line. If you have a choice to draw it through 3 or 4 candlesticks versus another direction where you have more options of candlesticks, then you need to go with the one that gives you the most options. So now that we have our set of guidelines, we're going to keep this on the screen and we're going to go through an example of just drawing a simple trend line. After that, we're going to do an example of a basic chart pattern. I'm going to show you what to do and what not to do. And also, I'm going to give you an additional sort of little caveat to keep in mind when you're drawing trend lines on chart patterns. Okay, so this is a common example of why I would use a trend line in my technical analysis. I'm trying to find a trend line that we have consistently bounced off of in this pattern. So let's go ahead and get our line tool and let's try and draw this trend line. I'm going to turn the snap off. We're going to draw a trend line starting back here in history. So I want to see, because you can see right here, we had some pretty a consistent trend on the way up. Now I could extend that trend line all the way here. And let's see how we feel about this trend line. So we have many touches. So over here we've got 1, 2. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to count about 8 touches over here. Then we bounce off this trend line. We see some really big bull moves. Now we come back down and we're starting to trend downwards. We break through this trend line, we go back on, we bounce off of it again. We see a really big move. We come back down. And then now we've broken through this trend line again. We're underneath this trend line. And I like this trend line because it's showing us both resistance right here And right here, we have some resistance right here. We rejected it and went even further. So this is, to me, a pretty valid trend line to be watching, because if we can eventually get through this trend line on the way back, we could see a big move, because this is sufficient resistance and support. Even though we're talking about trend lines, go back to the beginning of the video when I pointed out that trend lines help us see support and resistance in a chart. And when a level has acted as both support and resistance in the past, that is key to making it a strong level. And I just want to point out very quickly, if you haven't watched my video on how to find the strongest levels of support and resistance, make sure you do that. The link is in the description. So we've identified a trend line that has been consistently throughout the history of this chart was support in the past, support over here, and it has now become resistance. So let's take a look at another possible way of how we could draw this trend line. So I'm just going to go back to my trend line tool. And again, I still want to start back here because we do have a solid trend. We can see we were bouncing off that trend. But let's say we want to encapsulate the deepest line, which we have right here. So we can see we touched our 8 touches, or however many this was. We don't really need to count that, but we can see we have the same amount of touches back here. But we don't have as many touches in this area of the chart. So yes, we did get a bounce right here, and this could possibly be considered our trend line, but look at over here. It just looks such a solid base that it just, to me, makes more sense that we should be touching that area. And when we touch that area, we are touching a lot more candlestick bodies than if we try to get every single action and not have any violations. Then look what we end up with. I don't think this is a very valid trend line because it's not showing me anything other than what was back here, which was over a year ago. So I want to know what's happening now in this chart, not just what happened a year ago. So I am more comfortable with the trend line being up here because we are seeing a lot more action around this trend line. And at the same time, we are able to make this work with the historical levels in this chart. So this is the new trend line that we have taken a look at. And let's just get that first trend line that we talked about back up on the screen and we can compare them. So for this trend line, is a little bit different. You can see the two of them. They are quite different. So they both have the intersections at the beginning, so they are equal there. None of them are touching any of this history, but our top trend line is intersecting this pullback and a little bit of a bounce. So we have a little bit of some support here. You can see we have some support and a bounce off of it. And then we dipped through it, and now we're trying to go through it. So here we have two trend lines that we can be looking at. And both of these are going to bring our attention to areas that we should investigate further in this chart for both support and resistance. For the time being, we don't really need this top trend line, so I wouldn't keep this on my chart, but I would want to try and remember that this exists, but I would just worry about this when I get closer to that point in the future. We're not really near that level right now, so I don't want to leave that on my chart because it's going to make it too busy. So we like this trend line better than that last trend line, but let's go back to that first trend line that we found, which shows us the most recent bounce. So if we use this as our trend line, what is it telling us? It's telling us that we bounced off of it, yes, but it's further away from the above trend line, which the above trend line has way more touches as support. So we're going to go with this top trend line because remember the rules here. You want to have as many touches as possible. And so here we have way more touches than we have here. So we're going to get rid of this one. We're going to reject that one. And this is the one we're going to be watching for this chart. So you can see how these 3 simple guidelines allowed us to follow a process to eliminate different trend lines and basically come up with the best trend line according to these guidelines. So these are the guidelines that you should be following when you're trying to come up with trend lines. Now in the next part of the video, I'm going to walk you through a basic chart example, and we're going to use these guidelines, and then we're going to add another little caveat to those guidelines for our chart patterns. So when we're drawing chart patterns, so we keep these same guidelines in mind, but we're going to add a new caveat, and that is to encapsulate the recent price action to the best of your ability when you're drawing a chart pattern. So this is the type of chart pattern that I see lots of new traders working with. So let's just take a look at our guidelines and if this is meeting the guidelines. So right away, we can see that at the bottom, we are okay. We are intersecting more than 3, yes, and we've chosen to do the candlestick bodies. But the caveat for drawing chart patterns is to encapsulate the recent price action to the best of your ability. So it doesn't really help us as much when we're looking back here in time at these areas where we've had support. We want to make sure that we're seeing something happen recently. So I think the bottom trend line's okay. We're going to leave that for now. We almost touched it over here. We almost touched it over here. And yes, we touched it here. But let's really look at this top trend line. The top trend line is basically, we're not even touching as many as we need to touch at least 3. So let's bring this down and make it so that we are touching 3. So on end, we're encapsulating the most current price action, and so that brings us down to here. So we're touching 1, 2, 3, 4 areas. Now that has us making a violation here, but I'm okay with that violation because what we've seen here is we tested this, broke through it, came back down, and then we were in this trend. Now let's try and get this a little tighter and see if it works even better. Because if we bring this all the way back here, we could even say that we have more resistance happening here than we have at the top of there. So yes, we broke bull out of this pattern for a while, but we came back in here, and then here's a level that we were continuing to test. Broke it here, then came back inside it again. So to me, this chart pattern is more realistic to what's going on in this chart. Now, it might not look as pretty as the other one because it doesn't encapsulate absolutely everything, but it tells a better story because you can see that over here, we had support from it. Then over here, we tested it. We broke through it. Then we came back into it. Then we tested it again, and it's a hard break out of that area. Come back, got support from it till we broke through it again. And now we've been forming this really tight sort of chart pattern right here that is getting pretty tight and maybe looking to break out soon. So this is the kind of chart pattern that I would be interested in as a breakout trader. And so now I've walked you through the story of what I see in this simple chart pattern. I'm going to move this back to the way that it was before. And this is what I do see a lot of traders doing. And you can see right here that there's no story. There's nothing encapsulating the recent price action. There's nothing here that would have my interest. So these types of things are going to start to jump out at you. When you see patterns like this, you're going to want to take your trend lines and go as tight as possible in order to tell a story. And remember, when you're looking at these patterns, you need to be asking yourself why you're putting the lines in the places that you're putting them. So now that you know how to draw trend lines, the most important thing that you can do now that's going to continue your learning process is to chart as much as you can. So basically, do some charts, save your charts, go back to them, do some more charts. And then when you're ready, which should be sooner rather than later, you need to find a community and actually share your charts. I know that new traders are afraid to share their charts with others, but that is basically how you learn. If you can find a community where there are more advanced traders that can look over your charts and see what it is that you're doing and help you and maybe give you some advice, then that's really going to help you grow as a technical analyst. In my Discord server, we have a channel that is dedicated specifically for newer traders to share their charts. And then the in-house analysts will go and post comments and feedback, and they're happy to do it because we were all at one point learning just like you. The link for that Discord's in the description. And remember, even if you don't share your charts in this community, find a community and chart and share.